Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is Friday, May 2nd, 100 days. It's hard to think of any other first 100-day period in U.S. history that has been more consequential for the world than these last 100 days. Of course, the 100-day mark goes back to FDR in 1933, but his reordering was domestic. Trump's has been domestic and foreign, or as he told The Atlantic last week, in his second term, quote, "I run the country and the world." So how is it going? That's the question we're going to be addressing today, notably with respect to how Trump is running the world. Perhaps most shocked and definitely most affected have been America's traditional allies. They don't like what they're seeing, and they are reacting accordingly, including this week in Canada, where the Liberals earned a fourth successive term, thanks in large part to Trump's threats, repeated even on Election Day, to make Canada the 51st U.S. state. Most predictable, yet probably most shattering, has been Trump's effort to remake the global economy by imposing tariffs on U.S. imports of goods to levels not seen since 1901. A U.S. trade war has effectively frozen trade between the two countries going forward. Indeed, inbound container shipping into the port of Los Angeles for next week is down 45% compared to a year ago. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said the standoff is unsustainable. That much is clear. But who will blink first, Trump or Xi? Finally, Trump sold himself to the American people as a peacemaker. He promised to end Russia's war against Ukraine in 24 hours, even before his inauguration. And he took credit for the ceasefire in Gaza that had been under negotiations for over a year. But the Ukraine war continues unabated, and Israel is bombing Gaza relentlessly, occupying large swaths of the Strip and laying siege on its population. In other words, peace is no closer today than when Donald Trump came back to office over 100 days ago. So here to make sense of these first 100 days are three reporters who are covering these stories. Stefanie Bolzen is North America editor of Die Welt. Bobby Ghosh is senior editor Digital Weekend of Bloomberg. And Philip Stevens is contributing editor of the Financial Times and author of Inside Out Substack newsletter. Good afternoon, Philip. Good morning, Stefanie and Bobby. Great to see you all. Stefanie, let's start with you. The allies, in some ways, were prepared, but they really weren't for what they got to see in the first 100 days. In fact, all of us were sort of prepared, but then really not. How has the reaction been in Europe, but also in Canada, in Asia? There's an election, I think, tomorrow in Australia as well. How are things being seen by the allies who, for really 80 years, and in some ways even longer, have been relying on the United States for their security, to some extent for their prosperity, and certainly for their freedom?
I think it was quite telling that on the one hand, Donald Trump in that interview with The Atlantic, he said he's not only now in his second term running the US, he's also running the world. But at the same time, on Tuesday night, when he got on the stage in Warren in Michigan, he hardly talked at all about foreign policy because he has nothing to, he has not delivered anything. So the one thing he mostly talked about was, of course, migration, because migration is what he can show, well, results. I think there were some numbers out that in March 2024, when Joe Biden was still president, there were around 137,000 crossings, illegal crossings into the United States, and now they're down to 7,000. For many reasons, also pressuring the Mexican government, troops on the border, and so on and so forth. But he didn't talk about foreign policy or Ukraine or Israel. Very hardly touched it. So what is the reaction? I mean, in Europe, the reaction is obvious because they try to unite, they try to find ways to bolster their defense. In the case of my country, Germany, there has been some historical developments when the new or the to be sworn in Chancellor Friedrich Merz, that's going to be this coming Tuesday, he actually pushed through legislation that Germany can, in the case of defense spending, lift the debt brake, which is a constitutional debt brake. So that's really historical. This is just one example how now Europe reacts. When it comes to Canada, I was in Canada early April to report on the election, and I was really struck. I admit it was the first time I was in Canada. And I went to Hamilton outside Toronto, which is one of these old steel towns, and I talked to some steel workers there. And it really hit me how close Americans and Canadians are. I mean, for you, that's obvious, yeah. But for me, this was new, and how puzzled they were, and how shocked, and how angry. And one of these steel workers said to me, "Look, we had a good deal in the first Trump term. He destroyed NAFTA, and then we renegotiated. We had a good deal. Now he comes again. We have to renegotiate again. The result is it's going to get ugly. Americans will hate Canadians, and Canadians will hate Americans. And there you go. This is what Donald Trump believes. And maybe I leave it there for now."
Yeah, no, actually, now that I think about it, I think the Canadian-U.S. relationship is the same as the French-German relationship in some ways. I mean, yes, there are old issues, and we shouldn't forget. After all, the last time foreign power went into the United States, they came from Canada. So it's not that it doesn't exist, but when you go to Alsace-Lorraine today, the idea of a trade war between French and Germans is probably as alien as it is for the people in Hamilton or Windsor, Ontario. It really is a change, and of course, the results in the election, Bobby, were pretty remarkable in some ways. The Liberals coming back from a 25-point deficit, being really given up perhaps even as the real opposition party, to now leading the government, not yet quite with a majority, but almost a majority. You are traveling and talking to lots of people around the world, including in India, which of course has hooked its wagon on the U.S. force for a while. What are you hearing from allied people and countries' leaders about the reaction to Trump in the first 100 days?
Well, it is a tired old cliche, but there is a reason why it still works. There is a sense of watching a slow motion train crash by ordinary people, friends who are not journalists, as well as decision makers and people in politics, government, and business. Everyone says a variation of the same thing. We knew some of this was coming. We could not have imagined that he was this serious about these things when he talked about them in the election. And we certainly didn't expect all of this to happen at the same time and with such speed. Depending on who you ask and where they are, the focus is on different parts of Trump's 100-day performance. A lot of it is on Elon Musk and Ghosh. That was one striking thing that nobody expected, and you could argue perhaps that was the one thing we weren't warned about. Almost everything else we were warned about. Musk and Ghosh, maybe not so much. I cover mostly the Middle East and Africa and the Indian subcontinent and parts of Asia, and across the board there's still a lingering shock at the American the rapid reduction of America's footprint, both literal as well as metaphorical, in diplomatic affairs, in foreign affairs in general. The most striking case being that of U.S. aid and the rapid destruction of it. And the fact that there does not seem to be, unlike with, let's say, the Voice of America and some other areas where there has been a pushback, and you can still cling to the hopes that the courts might be able to fix and undo some of that damage. With the USA damage, it looks unlikely. There has been shock at the performance of Marco Rubio. His appointment had sort of allowed for just a little bit of hope that there might be a grown-up in the room. Doesn't seem to have panned out that way. And it's hard to focus. I mean, in the Middle East, everyone's waiting for Trump's trip there, which is soon, and to see what he has to say there. There's no expectation of anything positive coming out of it. The question is, how much more damage can he do at this moment? The one area that I would, in all of this sort of snowstorm of crises, the one area that I've been trying to focus on a little bit recently is on the border between India and Pakistan, because there is a real risk of war there, and war between two nuclear powers that could be devastating. And historically, when these two countries have come this close, the United States has played an enormous role in keeping them apart, as you well know, Ivo. The United States is not, and there's been rhetorically, Trump and the White House have said they want to play a role, but there does not seem to be a genuine interest and ability to do that. And there's nobody else who seems able, willing, capable of stepping into that breach. And this is a real, immediate crisis, the kind that we had nightmares about before Trump swore in. What happens when two nuclear-powered countries go at each other's throat and the United States is not around to play the peacemaker? We are in that nightmare right now.
Yeah, no, I think Bobby pointing that out is a good thing. We talked about it last week, and sort of also the change in Modi, who really isn't looking to the United States to help diffuse this crisis. He wants to use it for his own political ends. Doesn't need the Pakistanis to some do. But you're right that normally the U.S., the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, others would be intimately involved on an hour-to-hour basis to try to diffuse this. And Marco Rubio, other than I guess 2 phone calls to the counterparts in Pakistan and India, hasn't done anything. Now, of course, the difficulty for Marco Rubio is he now has 7 jobs. He's Secretary of State. He's interim National Security Advisor. He's Archivist of the United States. He probably has got on the board of the Kennedy Center, because everybody in the cabinet seems to be on the board of the Kennedy Center. And he's got a department without anybody being confirmed, which is hard for anybody. Philip, lastly, to you, I think what I have been most struck with is that the allies are moving along the 7 stages of grief, and they've moved from anger to action, and you are seeing countries around the world saying, you know what, maybe, as Mert said, we need to be more independent from the United States, and maybe we can just do this ourselves, and we don't need the United States anymore. And how do you look at that?
I think that's certainly so, but I think what we see, I think it's clear now, even to the most ardent Atlanticists, that the relationship, Trump or whoever, is never going to be the same again. Europe is no longer going to be able to rely, as it did, so absolutely on the American security guarantee. So there is this understanding things are going to change. And as you say, we're going to have to do things ourselves, and that's a good thing. And Stefanie said Germany is lifting its spending on defense in a huge way. Britain and France and Poland are getting together in a serious way this time, to discuss military cooperation. But actually, in a way, the Europeans are operating on 2 timelines. The first timeline is, look, although we're seeing the limits of US power now, as you said, in Ukraine, but in other parts of the world, in the Middle East and Africa as well, the US still has a capacity to do enormous damage in the short term, as we may see on trade if the standoff with China doesn't end. So on the one hand, you have European governments trying where they can to be emollient. We saw the European Commission this week saying, look, there's still a deal to be done on trade, that we can import more American gas. And then there's a second timeline, which is the sort of medium to long term, which is we prepare for the next time and make sure that the next time we're independent, we have our own resources, we look after much more of our own security, and we make our own choices economically. So there are those 2 tracks, as it were. In the short term, we don't want a complete immediate rupture with Trump. And if as Trump, as we now see, It's beginning to face realities, the complexities of the bold promises. If we can help him to do that and to, if you like, keep him on board with Ukraine, to keep him on board at least rhetorically with NATO for the short term, we'll do that. But yeah, in the medium to long term, the old order is gone, and we Europeans are going to have to look after ourselves.
Stefanie, I want to come back to you just for finally. I guess on this point, how do you read the fundamental commitment not only of leaders and governments, but I guess of the people, to understand what it means to reduce vulnerability, dependence on the United States, and become more independent? Is the German public, is the British public, or the French public, is the Canadian public prepared to do what it will take in some ways to achieve the strength necessary to face the world without the United States backing?
I cannot really speak for each of those countries, but I can speak for Germany. And I was quite impressed. I was back in Germany for the first time in a year and a half over Easter, and spoke to a lot of friends and family. And I was really flabbergasted by the mind shift. So talking to people who in the old, a year ago even, would have said, no, we shouldn't be looking after our defense. We should try and maybe sort it out with Russia. I mean, I don't quite know these people, but I do have some people in my wider circle who would say that. And now coming back and an absolute determined mood that Germany has to move on and Germany has to change. And there was a poll out last weekend, and 74% of the German public is saying we have to stand up to Donald Trump. So I think what they've seen in the last 100 days really has proven finally that we are definitely in a different era. And the Zeitenwende, as we call it in Germany, the change of times that Olaf Scholz announced after the start of the Ukraine war back in 22, this is now really needs to be done. I mean, but then doing it or saying it and doing it are two things. And there's so much pressure on Friedrich Merz, but he continues in a very, very eloquent, very strong way. He came out this week saying Germany has to be a powerful Mittelmacht, and this is our role, and we're taking it seriously.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting because I think the sense you get from people and polling and everything else, there is and as you talked about in Canada, and we saw in the elections, a huge mobilization of we need to stand on our own because we can no longer depend on this United States. Is real. I guess, Bobby, just to use this as a way to switch over to the trade issue, particularly the U.S.-China trade issue. We haven't really talked about the opportunity that America's withdrawal from the world is providing to China. In some ways, we are seeing it. I was talking to someone who had just spent a couple of days at the UN and was just astonished to see the absence of the United States and the complete dominance of China as the only power that really was able to express itself, because the Europeans still are divided in some ways. How do you first of all, where do you see this trade standoff? I mean, it's really a mutual trade embargo. Let's call it what it is, because there's no way you can trade at these levels of tariffs: 145% for U.S. Chinese imports and 125% for U.S. imports into China. But what does this say about what the Chinese are able to do, and are Europeans and others, the Indians, now likely to have to choose between the United States and China, or can they play both balls? It's a really devilishly complicated set of issues.
Yeah, it is, and especially because across the world now, to separate, particularly in the goods. I mean, service is a whole separate idea, but with manufactured goods, even European exports to the United States have Chinese components in them, and European exports to China have American components in them, and it makes it all sort of devilish, but in multiple dimension, to try and figure out how you sort of make these things, how you price them, how you deal with all of those tariff barriers. it's hard to see any winners come out of this. I'm sure across the world, every country is trying to figure out, can we game this? If this is our new reality, can we game this in a way that works out to our advantage? And I think all of them will find at the end that yes, you might gain a little bit here, but you lose a lot over there. And so I don't think, because of the nature of the world as it is now, I don't think it is possible for anybody to come out of this and claim outright that they are the winners. I think everybody stands to lose when these two countries go head to head like this. The Indians are just one example, and I was recently speaking to some very senior officials there, and they're scratching their heads. They have to take a public posture in which they express some degree of confidence, because that's what officials have to do. They have to reassure their own people. But in private conversations, in conversations that they're having with their business community, the advice that they're giving is all bets are off. Nothing can be predicted beyond a few weeks at a time. You're basically, what they're telling their own business community is, you're kind of on your own here. Or even worse, what can you tell us in what you're hearing that we can factor into our policy decisions? It's incredibly, incredibly hard. That obviously India would love for American companies, or companies in general, that no longer manufacture in China for some reason, to come and manufacture in India. That's not going to happen. That's certainly not going to happen overnight. India does not have the infrastructure to deal with that kind of thing. There are many other countries that are craving that same kind of investment. There are no shortcuts. I think what we're going to see, if this situation continues, is global. This is something actually close to the pandemic as the nearest analog of something that will affect every country, and will affect every country badly. Nobody comes out of this in any kind of positive way.
Philip, if you agree with that the sense that this is going to be have global ramifications that are negative for everyone, and if so, how does one get out of this, and who in the end is more likely to find a way out that in the longer term strengthens them rather than weakens them, at least in a comparative perspective, given that everybody's losing?
I think Bobby's right, and you're right. No one wins from trade wars. Everyone loses. And that's why we've been, just since, for the last 80 years, we were dismantling trade barriers, because we realized that, with odd problems here and there, basically most people win from lower trade barriers. You put trade barriers up, and particularly at this, absurd level, everyone loses. I think the view I hear among Europeans is that America's, that no one's going to win as between China and the US, but the US is going to lose a lot more badly. And, I think we've seen now from Beijing, the message from Beijing now, don't kneel down. The whole series this week of foreign ministry videos, propaganda videos put out there saying that China is now the defender of the global South against the American bully. And the Chinese are standing up to the US, not just for ourselves, but for all the sort of smaller countries in the global South. So, and I think, the calculation that a lot of people make is a simple one. Who's the most resilient? Is it, are American consumers 3, 6 months, 9 months down the line, American voters and consumers going to be more resilient than Chinese workers? Because, this is going to hurt China. It's going to hurt Chinese jobs and factories. But who's the most resilient? And I think most people think it's the Chinese. They have the state capacity to keep their economy afloat. They have the state capacity, if necessary, to pay the people who are losing their jobs the expectation. So the expectation is that the US Trump will have to find a way to climb down. And as he has in various other areas, and he has been climbing down in other areas. I think as far as Europe's concerned, Europe's not going to fall into the arms of China. It's not going to say, okay, America's unreliable, so we're going to, hug the Chinese, because we have, as Europeans, our own fears about China's ambitions and its own expectations. But on the other hand, the idea, which, a year ago you could have said was entirely plausible, that the US and Europe could operate in tandem in restricting Chinese, dumping, in restricting Chinese access to technologies, that's gone now. So, the US isn't going to get any help from the Europeans in this battle. The Europeans are going to sit back. And as I say, Europe still wants a trade deal with the US because it doesn't want the short-term damage. But in the end, it thinks that the US is the biggest loser. We're all losers, but the US will be the biggest loser. And Trump, if he doesn't recognize it himself, will be forced to recognize it by American voters.
So, Stefanie, as the person who actually lives in Washington and reports from there, help us sort of understand how the administration is dealing with, on the one hand, the reality that every single economist, and frankly, virtually every analyst, says that if in this trade war, China has the advantage because it has alternative means of buying the things that it needs. It also has alternative means to deal with demand by basically upping up consumption within China. And the United States doesn't have alternative means on the imports that it relies on. And that's why people are talking about empty shelving, including the President of the United States now. And on the other hand, we talked about this Atlantic interview, which is just extraordinary as an interview. But really, if people have not read the interview, they need to read it, in which Trump probably gives the best perspective of why he believes that tariffs are good for the United States, that the world has been taking advantage of the United States for 50 years, and that now we're going to get our money back. And under those circumstances, you have an administration, the president at least, that just is convinced he's right. 78 years old, you don't teach an old dog new tricks. And the reality that he's wrong. And so when you talk to people in Washington, where I think this reality, this is true, right? This is how people are seeing it. How are they expecting this to come out?
When you talk to people here, they just recognize that there is actually not an administration. There's only a president. And it's the president who decides. And the president is astonishingly honest. He goes out the day before yesterday, I think it was, and says, and the kids for Christmas, they get 2 dolls and not 30 anymore. So there you go. So, which I found absolutely, I'm living in the land of capitalism. The president tells parents that now the kids get only 2 dolls and not 30 anymore for Christmas. It's, but I think it's this thing about tariffs, and Trump said that during the election campaign, interview he had, or a meeting with the Wall Street Journal. He said, there is no more beautiful word than tariffs. Maybe love, maybe family, but tariff is the most beautiful. So he's obviously completely obsessed with it. So what does he do? His Treasury Secretary seems to try and mitigate the worst from time to time, but I think his influence is limited. And then Trump sometimes listens. So on Tuesday, before the event in Michigan, he actually tweaked a little bit the tariffs so that automotive producers in the US could now get a bit of an easier way to kind of confront the tariffs that were coming in. It's a staggered relief of taxes, of tariffs if you produce in the United States. So he is doing things from time to time, but I think on the big scale he's not changing track. And I think it's to be seen. Everybody is, of course, investors, for example. Investors are saying, why would we go and put our money now in the United States? Because we don't know what the tariffs will look like tomorrow or the week after or in 3 months. On the other hand, you have companies in the United States, and I've been talking to CEOs who say, well, great, if China is out of the game because you can't buy from China anymore, it's too expensive, well, then we up our prices here and we make more profit. So wherever you look, it's bad for the United States, it's bad for the consumers in the United States, and it's bad for the rest of the world. But Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and he is the one who decides.
So I guess, Bobby, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that, the sort of absence of reality in the White House, came across, I think, with this ruling that Chinese carriers of LNG are going to face of American LNG face huge charges, and the president saying we want Americans, but then it turns out that the US does not have a single US LNG carrier. So if not the Chinese, who?
Well, I mean, that's the problem, right? I mean, he's playing offense without having thought through the defense. And anybody who knows any sport or any war or anything else knows that if you're only on the offensive, you're going to be losing a lot. And then, particularly when you score a lot of old goals, to take Bobby and my favorite sport as a metaphor. Bobby, I want to get back to you because it seems to me there is one way out, which is, under our constitutional system, Congress actually determines commerce, and it is possible, if things get bad enough, for Congress to take control and say the tariffs are to vote against the tariffs. And it's hard for me to see that the courts are going to, on this matter, which is about as clear in the Constitution as you can, are going to side with the president. No, the president can do this in any way he wants, and the court and Congress can't. But that means Congress has to act.
That means the Republican Party has to grow a spine, which it has conspicuously lacked until now. The party his own party seems completely unwilling to even gently push back against his ideas. And the core advisors around him are not dependent on the party as much as they're dependent entirely on him for their positions. So you're right. Congress does have the authority and some of the tools to stop all of this madness, but it has not yet demonstrated any willingness to do so. It has not even shown the willingness to do the bare minimum, and that worries me. The courts are another degree of separation away from this. It is in the give of Congress, but he is behaving as if Congress does not exist. He's behaving as if he's absolutely confident that his party will bow to anything and everything he says, including when he says he wants to be Pope. We are in a completely unprecedented situation in that the checks and balances that we've been led to believe were at the heart of the American system. And having grown up outside this country and watched it from afar with great admiration, I had every faith in those checks and balances. It turns out that those checks and balances were predicated on human questions, not structural ones. They were predicated on the executive branch having a sense of responsibility and shame, and the legislative branch having a sense of honor and decency and political courage. These are not things you can legislate. These are not things you can put down in the Constitution. But it turns out these are the things that you need in order to get us out of this situation.
Yes, a government of men rather than of laws. It turns out is how it always works. And the only before we got on the air, I said I have flashes of optimism, very brief, and one of them is that if his popularity does continue to slide as quickly as it is, that all of a sudden political courage on the Republican side will reemerge, because if their future depends on breaking with Trump, they may do so. Whether that will succeed, who knows? We're certainly not there yet. Philip, let's last issue that really has dominated the 100 days is Trump the peacemaker. self-proclaimed peacemaker. He set out on his campaign that he was going to end all these stupid wars, and he would do it in a very short period of time. In the case of Ukraine, I think it's fair to say that they have invested more time and effort than I expected them to do, and I don't think that's true with the Middle East. They're now trying to do it with Iran, where they maybe get a deal that is not that different from the one that he walked away from in 2018. How would you sort of assess where we are on 100 days in on the peacemaking gambit and the urge and the urgency with which Donald Trump has tried to address these conflicts in order to find an end to them?
I think, to be candid, we're in the midst of a fog. We don't really know from which part of this fog and in which direction the president's going to emerge. You hear him some days saying, well, the Ukrainians are going to have to, knuckle down and accept this. And then the next day, well, he's saying, well, look, maybe Putin's been taking me for a ride. But I think the truth of it is, and the hard facts are simple. He said, I'm going to settle this on day one. What he did on day one instead was give up all his own leverage and basically make it impossible to settle in a reasonable way. Instead of, had the US and the Europeans got together on day one and said, look, we can agree to apply real pressure on Putin and on the Ukrainians as well, but we can apply real pressure, then there was a chance, I think, that Putin, for all his, determination to get his own way, may have had to come to the negotiating table reasonably. Instead, by saying basically, I'm just a sort of, I'm just the umpire here, and I'm not going to say this is Putin's fault, and maybe the Ukrainians, started this war, by provoking Putin, etc., and therefore basically splitting NATO. He gave away, he surrendered to Putin on the first day, and people say since when Putin's been playing him, he hasn't really had to play him because Trump has been playing himself, as it were. Now, 3 months in, or 100 and a few odd days in, there are moments when you think Trump has now realised this, and you see flashes, on his social media network or in interviews where he seems to be saying, well, look, maybe Putin has to do something. And then we saw this week, they signed the minerals deal with Ukraine, which suggests, and they allowed a shipment of, I think, £50 million worth of military equipment, the first of this administration, to go to Ukraine. So, people say, well, is he now saying, well, I'm shifting back towards Ukraine? But I mean, the truth is that Putin so far has got what he wanted, which is acceptance that this isn't a war of aggression by the US, and a split between the US and its allies. I don't see a way out for President Trump, because if he walks away, well, I think Europe won't walk away, and I think Europe, it'll be very difficult for the Ukrainians. It'll be very difficult for the Europeans, but they won't walk away. I think the idea that the US can tell Europeans to lift sanctions on Russia if it wants to do so is for the birds. I think Europeans are not going to lift sanctions as long as Russia won't negotiate properly. And Russia and Putin, like Xi, is not going to just do a deal because the president wants to do a deal. I mean, the big story for me, or the big puzzle for me in all this, is that Trump came in thinking, one thought anyway, he seemed to be suggesting that, I'm going to run the world with Xi and Putin. It's going to be the big three again. I'm going to do deals with these people because I'm powerful and they'll want to do deals with the US. He's now estranged completely from Xi and increasingly distant from Putin without any leverage on either. That seems to me about as bad as you get in geopolitics.
I think it's called the art of the deal. Stefanie, Philip, I think rightly mentioned the minerals deal, which when you read it, is a lot less onerous than earlier drafts were for Ukraine. And there's a very good article in the Financial Times sort of detailing how Ukraine used the mineral issue as a way to try to get Trump on its side. And Trump's frustration that Philip also talked about with Putin seems to be growing. I've argued that this is an opportunity for him to reverse course. But then you listen to Rubio and Vance yesterday, both of whom are talking about the war will continue. There's nothing we can do. The president has done, only the president could have even had people talk about peace. But the reality is the war is ongoing. Do you think that the likelihood is they will walk away, which, by the way, Putin would love, because particularly if walking away means reducing, if not eliminating, support for Ukraine? Is that where this is heading? Or do you see the possibility that perhaps what Philip argued for, stronger pressure, is now forthcoming?
I mean, first of all, let's just imagine Trump says, I walk away. I'm not doing anything anymore. What would happen in Europe? I mean, the fear and the risk of this escalating without U.S. protection and the U.S. Coming in and trying to sort it out, it would be an absolute shock. So I think this is a terrible scenario if they did do that. Obviously, they don't have a plan. They don't know what to do. They haven't thought that through at all. I wrote a comment last night that I thought the mineral deals is something, it's very interesting because it's a Zeitenwende in itself. Because, I mean, obviously always US foreign policy was transactional. Let's not be naive. It was not you good Americans helping the world. They always got something back for it. But this is really like dollar for dollar. We invest there, and then with the money we make, we pay the weapons that we maybe sent you, or you with the money you Ukrainians you can then buy new weapons. I think on the one hand, this is something, if I now naively think that there's something good left in Donald Trump, he can use that to say to the MAGA crowd, look, even if we still give the Ukrainians weapons, we get that money back. So I wonder whether he also constructed that to have still some option to play a role there. But I don't know what you think. Maybe I'm naive. And on the other hand, I think he wants to be the peacemaker. He wants to win the Nobel Prize. He has said that in that Oval Office meeting at the end of February. One of his of those journalists asked him, "Sir, what do you want to be?" And he wants to be a peacemaker. So if he now walks away from Ukraine, Russia, he definitely can't claim that anymore.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Bobby, please.
No, and in the meanwhile, while the world has been distracted by the many, many, many things that deserve attention out of Washington, he may have blundered us, the United States, into its latest never-ending war in Yemen. Completely unnecessary, with no stated and rational goals, no real plan, no understanding of the consequences. Yemen may seem to people in the MAGAverse as a small little country that incapable of defending itself. It is a country that sits astride some of the world's most important trade routes. It sits all too close to some of the most important hydrocarbon sources for the world economy. And it is a country that has managed to survive and beat back efforts from all kinds of regional powers with seemingly overwhelming military advantage. And Yemen still endures, and the Houthis still survive, and they still have the ability to fire off missiles in the direction of Israel. Getting into a war with the Houthis is about the dumbest thing I can imagine an American president doing at this moment in time. And yet, here we are. No American boots on the ground for now. But I don't know how long that situation is sustained. And in any case, in terms of the damage it can do to America's interest as well as to the global economy, it does not matter whether there are American boots on the ground. This is still a very, very bad idea. And this is a war It's not going to end with a peace deal. There is nobody on the other side who's even remotely interested in making such a deal.
Bobby, I'm very glad you mentioned this, because it is a good coda to the peacemaker failing to make peace. The peacemaker who, in fact, successfully ran against forever wars, both in 2016 and in 2024, has, without, in fact, a lot of people noticing, gotten us into another forever war, in this case in Yemen. And in a way that is truly not only for the geostrategic reasons you've talked about, but the military and geopolitical consequences, which are extraordinary. This is a war that is being run by the military. It has no political oversight, neither from the Secretary of Defense nor from the National Security Council, in which the military has decided they want everything they can possibly have. So there's 2 aircraft carriers, lots of air defense systems are all being deployed into the region. 6 B-2 bombers are in Diego Garcia, none of which is available for real security challenges, particularly in Asia, which is what the administration set out to deal with. So it is a contradiction among many ways. And perhaps that's the best way to sum up 100 days of Donald Trump. One contradiction after another. We've had him in all the ways that we have talked about. This has been really, truly enlightening. I want to thank Stefanie Bolzen of Die Welt, Philip Stevens of the Financial Times and his great Substack newsletter, Bobby Ghosh of Bloomberg. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.